That's Enough Out of You podcast is sponsored by Todd John's Law. Unfortunately, bad things happen to good people, whether it's the result of an auto accident caused by the carelessness of another driver or being charged with a crime. Dealing with the aftermath of a personal injury accident or being involved with the criminal justice system can be extremely difficult. That's why, whatever you're facing, you should never go it alone. You need an experienced attorney who will stand by you every step of the way. Todd is experienced, licensed, trusted, respected, and guaranteed. No one will work harder or more diligently on your behalf, and he will personally handle your case from beginning to end. Located on Drinker Street in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, Todd has been representing the legal rights of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre personal injury victims and those accused of a crime for over 20 years. At Todd John's Law, the utmost priority is ensuring that your rights are always protected and that your case is resolved as quickly and fairly as possible so that you can move on with your life. Call Todd John's Law at 570-876-6903. With Todd John's Law, you will receive equal justice under the law. All right, welcome to That's Enough Out of You. It is a weekly podcast, and we have all kinds of different topics and different guests. And if you've been listening to us, we appreciate it. If you haven't, well, good time to start because we have a great guest today. Before I introduce our guest, though, I'm going to introduce my co-host, Sean Kane. Sean, how's it going?
Billy Rays, this is going to be a great interview, buddy. Can't wait.
It sure is. Sure is. We have a returning guest today. We're really excited to bring back Rick Otto to the podcast. Rick, how's it going?
It's going great.
Thanks for coming back. Rick is the author of 3 books. I'm going to read the titles. So the first one that I have here on my list, The Paradox of Our National Security Complex, How Secrecy and Security Diminish Our Liberty and Threaten Our Democratic Republic. Rethinking America, Lies Masquerading as Truth, and The Hidden War, The Desecration of the Promise of America. And Rick, your books deal a lot with the lies that our government feeds us, and how America has really since the 60s just been on sort of a downward trajectory with regard to how what the government is doing and how we're kind of just I don't know. I mean, we just kind of have to. We're just taking it, right? We don't really have, we have voices, but I think the fear is, and I know this is something that we've encountered on the podcast, and I'm interested, Rick, in how you handle it, is when you don't praise the country, when you're not rah USA, go USA all the time, and you criticize the government, you criticize the country, you get a lot of attacking back, get a lot of people calling you a traitor, calling you, anti-American. We get that. We've been getting that, and we're just a small little podcast. I'm wondering, if you're getting that and how you handle that.
Yeah, I've lost friendships over my books.
Yeah.
Not because I wanted to end the friendships, but they called me a conspiracy theorist, and they got extremely angry at me, and they slowly stopped calling me and then slowly just pulled themselves out of my life. A lot of these issues that I talk about in my book, whether it's national security or the assassination of the 60s or Russiagate, it's very tough for people to accept what I perceive to be the truth. And I think there's a mountain of evidence to support what I'm trying to write about. And it's not that you have to agree with me, but you should do your own research. But it's very tough for people to accept that they've been living in a lie and that their country is something totally different than what they thought it was. I had the luxury, I guess you can say, of researching these books for years, and so that helped prepare me for what I discovered, because it didn't all just happen at once. I had to rethink a lot of things when I looked into it, because As the great French writer Albert Camus said, I should be able to love my country and still love justice. And it was tough. I was red pilled, I guess they say from the movie, right? The Matrix. I was red pilled. I had to deal with it, and I dealt with it. But it is tough because there's a sensitive side to me, but I'm also kind of used to it. On Facebook, they don't seem to be doing it as often, but sometimes if I post something or say something, I will get some nasty responses. And I've stopped replying to those people, like very nicely pointing out some facts, because they seem to get angrier when I point out the facts. So I sort of deal with it the same way Chris Hedges does. I don't read too much into it. I figure these people have their own reasons for being, they don't want to see the truth, and I'm not going to be able to convince them, and I'm not going to waste my time trying to do that. People that are interested and have an open mind and they want to hear me out, I'm more than happy to talk about these issues.
And I think if you don't know by now that we've been lied to as a country, going back to, just going back to JFK, if you don't realize by now that
Before that, Billy.
right, even before that, but I mean, just the JFK assassination, Watergate, all of these, Iran-Contra, all of these things that have happened over our lifetime, and a little bit before our lifetime, Rick. If you don't realize by now that there are things going on that we're being lied to about, that the government is doing, you're burying your head in the sand. You're just not being truthful with yourself. So it's very, very difficult sometimes for people to accept the fact, like you said, Rick, that we're living in a country where things are happening behind the scenes. Things are happening with government officials and sort of shadow things that are happening behind the scenes that we don't know about, because our parents had grown up in a world where it was, America was the greatest country in the world, and people were coming here by the millions, and this was the land of opportunity, and the streets were paved with gold, and you were fleeing countries that where things weren't working, and this was the place where you were going to get an opportunity. So just because that has sort of been ingrained in us, and now we're finding out things, and we're having to deal with these truths, it is difficult for people to accept. And I can see why people would get that angry, and why people would say, you guys are being traitors, you're anti-American, you're not supporting, the government. And what I think for us, our response is, we're just telling the truth. There's no agenda. We're not trying to make anybody, we're not trying to overthrow anything. We're not trying to change your opinion. We're not trying to do anything like that. We're just telling the truth. And I think that's what you're doing as well, Rick.
Well, I follow a couple of things, and sometimes it's tough, because sometimes you get you fall into confirmation bias. Sometimes you get emotional, and you have to calm down and look at it critically. And for me as a lawyer, I was trained to do that. But I try to follow what Malcolm X said. I'm for truth, no matter who says it. I'm for justice, no matter who it's for or against. And so, like, if you talk about Assad dropping chemical weapons, well, I don't know if you've watched Aaron Mate and Ray McGovern and them testifying about the evidence and all the whistleblowers that have been ignored. It's not because I'm for Assad or I'm pro-Assad or I think he's the Gandhi of Syria. It's because if he's not guilty of that particular crime, he's not guilty, in my opinion. It's the same with Trump. He may be guilty of things, but he wasn't guilty of colluding with Putin. And I think that's been proven over and over again by a number of formal investigations. And if people don't know those investigations, then or they're just following CNN and MSNBC, then they're obviously getting a false reality. And some people just don't want, I had a friend tell me Trump is such a horrible person, he used different words, that he has to be guilty. And so, you're wrong. That's the extent of their argument.
Mm-hmm.
And when I didn't, it's not that I'm omniscient. A lot of times I've been duped. I was duped about the assassinations. It took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that rogue elements within my government, very high level rogue elements, murdered a president that I admired, and then his brother, and were involved in civil rights leaders being murdered, and that was a tough red pill to take. And it was the same with Russiagate. I didn't initially follow it that much. I didn't know that much about Trump. I knew he was a corrupt real estate developer and had screwed a lot of people in contracts in Atlantic City and stuff. And I didn't admire him that much. But I was on a radio show with an investigative journalist, and he was there to talk about Russiagate, and I was there to talk about the JFK assassination. And it was called the Conspiracy Show. And so he basically referred to the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, which were all these retired military and intelligence officials that had come together because of the lies being told about the weapons of mass destruction and Saddam Hussein's involvement in 9/11. And they wrote a letter to President Trump telling him, don't believe the intelligence, it's wrong. It's not good intelligence. Don't do anything stupid. That's how they came together, and that's what helped form them. And Ray McGovern was one of the founders of that organization. And then he told me about William Binney, who was another member, who was the NSA technical director for years, and maybe people said he was a genius. And he was the inventor of the first massive surveillance program called Thin Thread. And essentially, but he was a strong believer, because I think he has libertarian aspects to his political views. He was a strong believer in the Constitution, so he didn't want to interfere with people's Fourth Amendment rights. So he built into his surveillance program protections. And so people couldn't decrypt or find out who was doing the talking until they went to the FISA court. He put these protections in, and he also created an algorithm that looked for the needle in the haystack. And of course, the NSA at that time, this was like 1999 and 2000, they didn't want that. They wanted to collect everything. They wanted everything. And so they subcontracted out to a company that built them Trailblazer that overwhelmed their analysts. They couldn't see anything. They were getting so much information. In any event, he told me about William Binney, and William Binney said that he was doing a forensic workup on Russiagate, and he was able to prove that it wasn't a hack, it was a leak. And so I started to go down and figure out, just like I did with the JFK assassination, who are the credible people, who are the people that are just trying to propagandize you, who are the people that just hate Trump so much they'd agree to anything. And I sorted it out, and I came up with my conclusions. And primarily, a lot of the work is in my second book. There are 3 essays on Russiagate, plus 2 essays on Julian Assange. And, Julian Assange got sucked up into the Russiagate thing because he was the one that released the DNC emails that, a lot of the left people haven't forgiven him for, because they think that damaged Hillary Clinton and allowed Trump to win. So, that's how I go about it. I also try not to hate people. I don't hate Putin. I don't hate Trump. I don't, I may not admire Trump, but I don't hate him, because, as Dr. King said, hatred just blinds you and keeps you from seeing things objectively. So I try not to hate people. I try to intellectually look at something and follow the evidence to where it goes. And if I can, just quote somebody that I do admire, John Adams. He was representing the British who were charged with killing some people at the Boston Massacre, and they claimed that they were unprovoked. And the Boston Massacre, of course, occurred in 1770 in Boston. And he said in his closing argument, and I think this is very true to the way we should all look at these things, you need to follow the facts and the evidence, like we did with the JFK assassination. If you can't apply what you learned in the JFK assassination to current events, then what's the point of learning it? Um,
Right.
Basically, John Adams said in his closing argument, facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. And he ended up winning the cases for those because he was able to prove, despite the emotion and all the propaganda around that massacre, that the British were provoked and they were mitigating factors. And so they didn't get the worst sentence. Some of them were found not guilty, and some of them got a minor sentence.
So Rick, a lot of good things there, but what we try to do on this show is we kind of take the political aspect out of it, and we'll criticize somebody, we'll praise them, no matter what side they're on. If they do something we think is wrong, we're going to criticize them. They do something bad, we don't care if they're on the left or the right. And I think as far as pushback against us, me and Billy get a lot of hate. People count us traitors. But I think the media in Hollywood also play a role in that, because their constant denial of the truth about the assassinations of the 60s and the truth about Vietnam, and the constant bashing of the Kennedys, which drives me crazy. And Hollywood plays such a key role in that, with these garbage movies they're putting out. This new lie coming out with Al Pacino, complete garbage on the 1960 election fix, which is just a complete lie, and stuff like that. But what I want to ask you, Rick, is take the politics out of it, because when you talked last time, you mentioned about Russiagate being a hoax. We had people come back, push back on us. Of course, our listeners that are more to the left are going to say, oh, no, he's wrong on that. And people that are more to the right that maybe support Trump are like, yeah, he was definitely right. But take the politics out of us and tell us why exactly Russiagate was a hoax in your research.
Okay, what I'm going to do is preface my comments, okay? Russiagate is not a left or right issue. If you're going to analyze Russiagate, you're going to follow the facts. And as a lawyer, I'm going to try to figure out what I could prove in a courtroom, okay? The other thing is just to talk about being a true patriot. A true patriot isn't somebody that blindly follows authority. The founding fathers didn't do that. They were revolutionaries. They risked everything they had because they thought what King George III was doing was wrong. And so they believed that true patriotism was dissenting when your government was overreaching or abusing its power. And Howard Zinn, the great historian, said the highest form of patriotism is to dissent. So true patriotism is not just saluting the flag and agreeing with the president of the United States, no matter what they tell you, because you're just opening yourself up over time for somebody to get into power that is going to take advantage of that, and they're going to turn this country into a dictatorship. And these are the things that we, who are trying to tell the truth, are trying to educate people that you need to question authority. You need to question these agencies. You don't have to hate your country. We don't want you to hate your country. We want you to be skeptical of what the government is telling you, that they may have ulterior motives or interests. Now, in terms of Russiagate, there are two aspects to Russiagate. There's the political aspect, and then there's the actual stealing of the emails, which started the, which didn't necessarily start the whole thing, but is a key factor in implicating Russia and Julian Assange in a collusion with helping Trump win the presidency. And essentially, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, led by William Binney and Ray McGovern, basically did some analysis on the documents that WikiLeaks put out, and documents, I don't know if you know Guccifer 2.0, but he was some persona or entity that took credit for uploading the documents 24 hours after Julian Assange said he had them, and they were trying to authenticate them and would be posting them later on. And in his post, he had one document that was had allegedly the fingerprints of a high-ranking GRU military intelligence officer within the Russian Federation. Okay, so that's the context of this. So allegedly, the Russians hacked into the DNC servers And then they uploaded all this information and then transported it over the web to a destination where they could get access to it, look it over, and then they forwarded it to WikiLeaks. That's essentially the hacking allegations in a nutshell. What William Binney and his team of forensic people looked at was, could you take all that information and transport it over the internet with the limitations of the technology in the spring of 2016 in 87 seconds? And what they did was they uploaded a similar amount of information to England, to other parts of Europe, and they couldn't do it in 87 seconds. It wouldn't accommodate them. They did find out that you could download that amount of information to a portable storage device, or what some people might call a thumb drive. You could do it in that amount of time. And that's how Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning did it. They downloaded all their information onto a thumb drive. The second thing they looked at was 500 documents on WikiLeaks site that were from the DNC. And what they found was that all these documents were date stamped and rounded up to the nearest even number. Okay, so this is a method of organization that is usually associated with a file allocation table, a FAT file. Now, these FAT things are associated with thumb drives. If you're doing a hacking, it usually date stamps and rounds things off to randomly, even odd numbers. And they looked at 500 DNC documents and they were all rounded to even numbers. So they said the probability of that happening would be 1 chance in 2 to the 500th power. So they said there was no way that this clearly, from their minds, came from a thumb drive. Okay. The other thing that, and is one of the reasons why John Brennan was so pissed at Julian Assange, is if you remember, Julian Assange released a whole bunch of documents in March of 2017 called Vault 7. You guys familiar with that?
Yeah, I am.
And essentially, it had a program on there called Marble Framework. And that was a program in which the CIA had developed, with the help of NSA technicians, the ability to synthetically implant the fingerprints of 5 other countries and leave those behind after they hacked into a secure computer system implicating those countries. Well, one of the countries that they were able to do that with was Russia. So Ray McGovern and William Binney and Professor Stephen F. Cohen, who was the Russian expert and actually lived in Russia, they believed that the CIA used Marble Framework to synthetically taint this document with Russian fingerprints. And they also believed that Lucifer 2.0 was an intelligence fiction. He was created either by the FBI or the CIA. And the reason why John Brennan was so pissed was because Julian Assange essentially embarrassed them and released this information. And so countries knew they had this capacity. And if they put 2 and 2 together, they could realize that, hey, this one document out of the hundreds of documents and thousands that they had from the DNC servers was tainted with this high-ranking Russian. And like Professor Stephen F. Cohen said, the Russians aren't that incompetent based on his research and knowledge of them. So, and then the last thing he wanted people to know is that the NSA controls all the points in the internet. You know, they have intersections. The internet comes in intersections where documents are collected, and then information is collected, and then they send it out to the different directions. And at every point where these communication places are, where they all get brought together and then sent out, the NSA has hacked into all those things. They collect all that information. Everything that's done over the internet, they know about. And he said, if the Russians hacked into the DNC servers, the NSA would have proof that they did it, because they even if they didn't see it in real time, they could go back to the time period in which the DNCs were allegedly hacked into. They could watch it being uploaded in real time, and then they could follow it to the individual computer that it was downloaded on. And then they'd figure out who owned the computer. They could do all that. They'd have all that information. And the fact that they didn't disclose any of that in the intelligent assessment, the community assessment that James Clapper talked about in January of 2017, the fact that they've never admitted it since, he said it's because they don't have that information. Therefore, he believes that all these things prove that it was a leak, not a hack. Now, there are two major witnesses that were never interviewed by Robert Mueller. One was Julian Assange, and he said that he received the material from a non-state actor. Now, you may say that's self-serving. Well, then we have Craig Murray, a former British ambassador who was an asset of WikiLeaks, who met with an individual who was representing a few, what he called, quote unquote, in his interview on dailymail.com, disgusted Democratic whistleblowers. That's who the person told him the package was from. And he handed him the package, and in that package was a thumb drive with all the emails on it. And he got it on American University in Washington, D.C. He was never interviewed. But that's what he said to the press. That's what he said in his writings on Consortium News. That's where he got the information from. And so the evidence in the public realm indicates, and I think substantiates, that it was a leak, not a hack. And if it was a leak, it most likely was done by somebody on the inside. Okay, so that's the leak versus the hack in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it. Now, the other things I'd say, okay, let's apply it. People understand the JFK assassination. And what Colonel Fletcher Prouty said, you know, whenever basic protocols are violated, that's when there's a red flag, there's something up, there's something wrong. The minute these basic protocols that the government does all the time is violated. Well, these emails, the servers rather, are the best evidence. They're like in a homicide, the body, okay? They are the best evidence. Now, the DNC hired CrowdStrike, a very dubious intelligence company, to do the analysis on their servers because they had a history of being anti-Russian, and they had accused Russia of doing things that turned out to be false later on. So they have a dubious record to begin with, all right? And so they're the only ones, first of all, they're the only ones that are allowed access to these computer servers. And Homeland Security, CIA, and FBI, they're fine with that. Then, when they're done their analysis and they do their report, a man named Attorney Michael Sussman, who did he work for? Hillary Clinton. He redacted all this information, blacked it out that he didn't want the FBI to see, and then he just forwarded what he wanted them to see. So they got this document, this report that was most of it was redacted and in black. When have you ever heard the FBI accepting that from a third party and then accepting that they'd come to the right conclusions? So there's two protocols violated here. One, they weren't allowed to see the full document. And two, why weren't they demanding the servers? Because if Putin, an adversary of the United States, had hacked into a DNC computer and had some impact on an election that caused someone to win an election, disturbing the whole democratic electoral process, you don't think that's a matter of national security in which they're going to demand to look at the evidence? No, it reminds me of the Warren Commission when they had no interest in the medical evidence, and the only documents they looked at were drawings. They never looked at any of the x-rays, any of the pictures of the autopsy, nothing. All they looked at were drawings. So there were some major, and even Robert Comey, the director of the FBI, said in an interview, yeah, most of the time we would want to look at the servers, and that's the best practice. Well, you know, he didn't answer why you didn't do it in this particular case, but they didn't. So those are the major things with the leak. Now, in terms of the political aspects, the Durham report, the U.S. federal attorney was asked to look into matters, I think during the Trump administration, that related to Russiagate. And what he looked into was the activities of the FBI. And essentially, what he found was, and which is verified by all the researchers and the people that have written about it, was that there was this guy, George Papadopoulos. He was approached in, I think, a lounge or a bar or something by a Professor Joseph Mifsud, and he claimed that he knew the niece of Vladimir Putin, and he introduced this woman to him that had nothing to do with Vladimir Putin. It was a sham. And he said that the Russians had this very important information that could, affect the election. And George Papadopoulos then discussed this with an Australian diplomat, Alexander Downer, and he wrote what he was told to Canberra, in Australia. And of course, the FBI got wind of that, and they opened their I think it was what was it, Operation Hurricane or something. So they opened Operation Hurricane, which was essentially an operation to figure out what this was all about. And then they opened Operation Typhoon, which was specifically assigned to figuring out if George Papadopoulos was involved in some sort of conspiracy. They found nothing. They found that George Papadopoulos had nothing to do with stealing emails. Joseph Mifsud is an interesting character because he lied to the Robert Mueller on 3 occasions under oath, and he never was charged with perjury, and he's disappeared. Nobody knows where he is right now. He's missing. And then you have Carter Page. They lied to the FISA courts regarding Carter Page, and they said he was involved in something, and lo and behold, in the FBI documents, he's apparently a CIA agent. He was an asset of the CIA and was reporting everything to the CIA. So he never was charged with anything. Michael Flynn. Now, George Papadopoulos was charged. He was charged with perjury. You see, the FBI, they have this practice where if they can't get you on the original charges, they try to get you into a perjury trap, they call it, where you make a misstatement to them during an investigation and they charge you with perjury. That's what they did to George Papadopoulos, and that's what they did to Michael Flynn, who initially was going to be Trump's NSA advisor. And so they had nothing to do with stealing emails or talking to Russians or anything like that. The only Russian that Michael Flynn talked to was the ambassador to Russia. And according to the Justice Department, who looked at it, they said that this is normal practice for the incoming administration to make contacts with major countries and let them know what their policy is going to be going forward. And I think he told, because of the growing Russiagate narrative, Barack Obama had thrown 30 Russian diplomats out of the country, and they were going to place sanctions on them. And Michael Flynn was saying, hey, don't recommend anything too harsh. I think we want to try to improve relations and that kind of thing. That's what he told them. And what he lied to the FBI about was the timing of this, because they caught him on a beach while he was on vacation, and he tried to play lawyer, which is a big mistake. He tried to figure out why they were asking him these questions, and so he was very vague, and he ended up giving them misstatements, and they charged him with perjury, which, by the way, has been withdrawn because they threatened to charge his son with criminal acts, and so his admission to perjury was not voluntary. And then you have Paul Manafort.
So Rick, I know there's a lot more to talk about with Russiagate. I did want to try to get to to the topic, to our next topic that we were planning on talking about, which is censorship. But go ahead, make your point about Paul Manafort. Go ahead.
Okay, he'll be the last point I'll make, and then I'll try to do a quick summary.
Okay.
Essentially, Paul Manafort was involved in some shenanigans trying to get some information from Ukraine and stuff. And the New York Times called it normal corruption, but they also had allegations that he had met with Julian Assange on 3 occasions. Okay, for you JFK buffs, this is important to understand. Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly went to Mexico City and went into the Cuban embassy and the Russian embassy trying to get a visa back to Cuba and then back to Russia. And he didn't get one, and then he left, right? And they had no pictures of him. And the only recording they had of him, 2 FBI agents were able to obtain it. And they told Hoover that that wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. They've been sitting on the investigation. They've been sitting on the interviews by the Dallas Police Department. They said that wasn't him.
Right.
So they had all this surveillance, and yet the cameras allegedly broke down, and they had all these excuses, but they had no pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay. The embassy in Ecuador, where Julian Assange was bugged by a Spanish group that the CIA had hired. And what's even really interesting about this is that Michael Pompeo had discussed kidnapping Julian Assange and or assassinating him. Okay, this is all in the record. And they essentially bugged the whole embassy. So there was nowhere that Julian Assange could go without people listening in on him, all right? They also, the British spent $19 million a year. They had cameras all around. They were monitoring him 24/7. This is where it's similar to Mexico City. And this is how you apply what you learned in JFK's assassination to what they're doing now. There was no pictures of Paul Manafort. There was no signing in. There was no audio recordings of Paul Manafort. There was nothing, because Paul Manafort never went to meet with Julian Assange. Julian Assange was not involved in a conspiracy with Putin and Trump's people to stop Hillary Clinton from being president of the United States. That's Russiagate in a nutshell. I simplified it because we could talk about this like you could the JFK assassination, but that's essentially the players. Nobody was charged. Oh, very quickly, no one was charged with affecting the election. There were 12 GRU military intelligence officers that were charged with gathering intelligence in the United States, like all intelligence people do. And they were linked. They weren't linked or proven to be linked. Simply, Robert Mueller said Guccifer 2.0 was a Russian, and he inadvertently uploaded a document that had Russian fingerprints on it, and they made a mistake. That's all that's in the Mueller report. The Mueller report says there was no collusion. They couldn't find any proof of collusion. The Senate Intelligence Committee said they could not find any proof of collusion. Bob Woodward, who wrote a book on on Trump, said he could not, in 2 years of research, find any proof of collusion. And the Durham report said that the FBI had lied, done all kinds of nefarious activities, and the Clinton administration is where the Russiagate thing came from. Hillary Clinton actually authorized her attorney to go to the FBI and say that Trump, there was an Alpha Bank server communicating to one of Trump's financial servers in New York. They couldn't prove any of that. She's the one that paid for the Steele dossier. The FBI documents said there was no actionable intelligence in the dossier. Most of it was internet gossip, and they said it was worthless. Okay, so if you look at everything that Rachel Maddow, for example, would be talking at the top of her lungs saying, this is it, Trump's going to go, all of it has been debunked.
Well, that's been going on for years. But I mean, a couple things. I do want to move on, but I mean, a couple things. So first of all, the Hillary Clinton, paying for the Steele dossier, that wasn't direct. I mean, she didn't directly pay for that. That was one of those things where it was campaign money that moved to one place, that moved to another place, that moved to another place, that eventually paid for that dossiers. But I mean, we can get into that another time, Rick. I agree. Obviously, yes, there's no evidence that there was direct collusion. I don't think there was collusion. I think simply because Trump wasn't smart enough to do that. What everybody's what the accusations were. I don't think he's smart enough to do that. I do.
He was under a microscope, Bill. He was under a microscope essentially for 4 years, and the two times they impeached him in the House, it had nothing to do with collusion with Russia.
No, I agree with that. They were political. Absolutely. But
I'm not a fan of Trump, and I'm a Democrat. Okay, I'm a Democrat. But I have to disclose, I was not a Hillary Clinton admirer. I did not vote for Hillary Clinton. I voted for Jill Stein in that election.
So, Rick, the only other thing I would say is that I do believe that there was social media that influenced that election. I think that for me, that's where I see if there was anything that was done to whether unfairly or whatever influence that election. I do believe there was a lot of social media, and I think a lot of it did come from Russia. Now, I don't have any evidence to prove that. That's just what I believe. But I do think that's the case. Anyway.
Bill, the only thing I would say to that is you should look at the Twitter revelations. Matt Taibbi and the other journalists that were involved. Twitter couldn't find any Russian, and they told them to suppress all these people. And Twitter actually was reluctant in some of the cases because they said, "My God, this isn't a Russian thing. This isn't a Russian thing." They couldn't really find any Russian. And a lot of the Democrats, my party, were kind of upset that they weren't finding anything. And the National Research Agency, which was implicated in the Mueller document, essentially they spent $100,000 over a period of several years, and 50% of those posts were posted after the election. 25% Facebook said weren't read, so there was only 25% of them that somebody might have read or seen. They were very amateurish. I don't know if you've seen some of them. They didn't know much about American culture, and the people that were doing this were paid minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
And when they challenged Robert Mueller, the NRA hired attorneys, and they went into an American courtroom, and they were going to defend themselves. They asked for the discovery, and all the charges against them were dropped. So now, of course, you could argue, well, Mueller and his people didn't want to release their classified documents. Well, I don't know. I think it's because they didn't have a case, and the whole thing was built on innuendo because they started. They were charging the people that they were posting for. So it's like what one of the anti-war journalists said. When have you ever heard of a intelligence agency charging people a fee to do things? So I think that needs to be looked into more. I respect your opinion on that, and it may turn out that you're right, but I think the Twitter revelations have on Russiagate and COVID have been not very kind to people like Adam Schiff and others that promoted Russiagate.
I think the one thing that as far as what the public believes on this, from people that I talk to and everything, a lot of them say, well, the ones that believe it say, well, Putin hated Hillary Clinton from her time as secretary. We know that. And, he was much closer to Trump. So he would definitely, want Trump in over Hillary. And I think, that's where a lot of the belief comes from the people that believe in this. But I'd really like to move on if you guys don't have anything else to.
No, I'm all set.
Yeah, let's move on.
Okay, so Bill, you want to get into censorship?
Sure.
Rick?
Yeah, Rick, that's another topic that you wanted to talk about. You brought that up at the end of our last podcast. And I'm just interested in some of your thoughts about censorship and what's going on today.
Well, I mean, essentially, some people say that they're freedom of speech absolutists, and the freedom of speech is an important foundational right that we have, and of which everything else is built off of, but it's not absolute. There are a number of things that you cannot do, or you could be prosecuted, or you could be sued if you did them. For example, defamation is not protected under freedom of speech, so you can be sued for libel or slander.
Mm-hmm.
And the only absolute defense to a lawsuit like that is the truth. So the other thing is that obscenity. Now, the Supreme Court has been very vague on this. One of the Supreme Court cases said that I know it when I see it. That's like the actual phrase in the ruling. But the extreme forms of obscenity or pornography are not allowed. And clearly, there's a ban on child pornography. And then fighting words and threats that might incite violence or lawlessness are not protected by the First Amendment. And certain types of hate speech, which do the same things, are also not protected by the First Amendment. However, general commentary on, and I'm reading this, one thing I highlighted, general commentary on political, religious, or social matters may not be punished, even if some people are so offended that they want to attack the speaker. But they say there's no exception exists for hate speech when it's related to racist threats. But speech may not be specifically punished because it is generally racist, sexist, anti-gay, or hostile to some religion. So, for example, if somebody said, I don't really like this religion X, I think they do this or that, and that repels me. You can't censor that type of speech. However, if you say to this specific priest or this specific minister had done something illegal, well, that would not be protected speech. You could be sued for defamation. And so, freedom of speech, the founding fathers knew this was the foundation of everything. If people can't speak out against their own government, then, why do all dictatorships, the first thing they want to do is squash dissent? And what they mean by that is they want to squash freedom of speech, because they don't want anyone hearing anything else other than their narrative. And you saw this with Russiagate. You saw it with the COVID policy. And I know COVID, that's another current issue that you can get into touchy ground. People don't want to talk about it. But the Twitter file downloads have shown a lot of doctors who had an alternative view of how COVID should be addressed were being either shadow banned or completely just banned from Twitter. They were shut down, including RFK Jr. He lost his Instagram account and he was being shadow banned, and some of his stuff was being suppressed as well. And the problem with that is that, the phrases that you would hear to shut these people down was, you have to have faith in science, you need to trust science. That's not how science works. A scientist puts out an idea and he goes about trying to prove the idea by trying to disprove it. And then when he thinks that, or she thinks that they've got something that they can now put it in a journal, then everyone else is not supposed to assume that they're absolutely right. They're supposed to attack it and attack it and attack it, and out will come the best understanding of that particular phenomenon. But sometimes science changes and we figure out, oh no, that person was wrong. Like Einstein figured out some things about gravity that Newton was wrong about. So, the best way to deal with bad speech is more speech. Like this podcast, for example. this podcast allows people to hear an alternative perspective from different authors that have researched different subjects and expose them to things that they may not see on the mainstream media or anything that's under corporate control. And people, unless they have an understanding or hear a variety of views, there's no way for them to cipher out what may be the truth. Because if all they're hearing is X, then they think X must be true. But if they hear that there's actually X, Y, and Z, then they have an opportunity to make up their own minds and to weigh the evidence. And that's how a democracy functions at its best, when people are fully informed about everything that's going on.
And Rick, I think that's really important because when you look at just take the Kennedy assassination, the media has censored in a way a lot of the truth tellers, and when they bring up the subject of the assassination, they don't bring on people like yourself or Jim D'Eugenio, who's an expert, or Lisa Peace, who's an expert. They bring on people like the hack, like Gerald Posner, who's a plagiarist and he doesn't fact check anything, and he's just a terrible, terrible journalist, in my opinion. And they bring him on and they praise his book called Case Closed, who he wrote and his own admission, didn't even read any of the declassified documents.
No.
I believe they actually came out after the book. So how do you have a book called Case Closed? You don't even read the documents. So that to me is pretty important, because the truth tellers, the real, researchers in this field have been censored by the mainstream media. They have been blocked. They haven't been given the access that hacks like Gerald Posner get. And even like another tool, Bugliosi, who wrote that awful book on the assassination. And we now know from Tom O'Neill's book that Bugliosi was a garbage human being himself, with a lot of stuff he was involved with. And he was involved in a lot of, very bad tactics during the Manson trial and the Manson investigation and whatnot. So, I think it's really important that certain people don't have access to certain subjects and others do. And the media picks and chooses who they want to put on the air and who they don't want to put on the air. And to me, that's a major problem and a major, major problem in this country.
It helps them control the narrative. And a lot of these so-called journalists, and some of them may be really good journalists, I don't know, but a lot of them are just stenographers. They just read the teleprompter, and everything is approved by the corporate structures above them. On very rare occasion, they're allowed to tell the truth, probably just to keep people thinking, oh, they were right about this. But most of the time, the corporate structures above the newsrooms who own them, they approve the parameters in which these people are allowed to operate. And if they go outside those parameters, and there have been a lot of journalists that have resigned from MSNBC, NBC, Fox News, because they said they weren't allowed to do what they wanted to do as a journalist, which was to tell the truth.
Rick, one of the things that we talked about when we talked to Lisa Peace a couple of weeks ago was the CIA control over the media, and so is that what, do you factor that in? I mean, is it the media conglomerate that is controlling the narrative? Is it the CIA? What is your opinion?
There are a number of factors. The 1996 Telecommunication Act, signed by Bill Clinton, basically took away the barriers that certain companies couldn't own more media outlets in a certain region. They couldn't own the television station, the radio station, and the newspaper. They could only own one of them. He took away those barriers. So people like Rupert Murdoch now can buy all the local news station. He can buy the newspapers in that city. And so everything that people read or hear or see goes through Rupert Murdoch. and what he allows.
And by the way, Rupert Murdoch is not American.
That's right.
For folks who are big fans of Fox News, I got news for you. It's not owned by an American. So that's one of the things that annoys me, is that these people who use the word patriot and get their information and their news from Fox News. It's not, the owner of that media conglomerate, that outlet is not a patriot of this country.
And it goes back even before the Communication Act of '96. Though the CIA had assets in the media long before that. In
Oh, yeah,
media,
what I was talking about, Sean, was that I think that's when corporations began to have an impact on what we were allowed to hear, see, or listen to.
right? But Rick, I think like media giants, Rick,
But
like
the CIA, ever since its founding, very shortly after its founding, as you know, Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, Frank Wisner, and the Philip Graham, the owner of Washington Post, they created Operation Mockingbird.
what I was trying to say though is media giants like Henry Luce. He had such power and such control, and he also had a connection to the CIA. He had a very strong connection to
Yes.
Alan Dulles. His wife, Claire
Exactly.
Booth Luce, was a CIA asset, and she had a very strong relationship with a key CIA agent
Yes.
by the name of David Atlee Phillips. So I
Yeah.
think the connection goes back because right from the beginning, the Kennedy assassination, there was some people out there that was questioning the lone gunman theory right from the beginning. And I think they were blocked right from the beginning. They weren't going to be allowed in their
Yeah,
thoughts and their
the
opinions on
narrative,
that.
the narrative became that it was a lone gunman about 45 minutes after the assassination. And
Right.
the people that were saying that there were shots from the front were pretty much shut down. And
Right.
I don't know if you ever saw that footage of Dan Rather saying that Kennedy's
Sure.
body violently went forward.
Yeah.
I don't care what you think happened on that day. No one that's watched the Zapruder film said he violently went forward.
No, and of course, Rick, it was Henry Luce's Time Life that bought the Zapruder film and basically, paid millions for it and then hid it for the American people for 12 years until Geraldo Rivera would have ended up showing it. Actually, well, it came out in the Garrison trial, but only the jurors seen it. But Henry Luce pays all this money for it, and then they just lock it away. So you see the control in they were controlling the narrative right from day one, and they did that with all of the assassinations of the '60s.
That's
Completely
right.
controlled the narrative right from the beginning, and made sure that people that were out there trying to get to the truth, they weren't going to have their say, and they weren't going to get their word out to people like the theory on the lone gunman was going to get out.
Well, have you seen John Stockwell being interviewed?
Yes, I have.
He said that 70% of the CIA budget was propaganda.
Sure.
And the way that they controlled domestic propaganda was that they'd plan a story overseas, and they would hope that it'd be picked up by somebody domestically. Now, the bar from them engaging in domestic propaganda, it's my understanding, in one of the Defense Authorization Acts that was removed. So the CIA now is allowed to propagandize the American people directly.
Unbelievable.
And another thing is, Rick, we used to have something in this country called equal time, where if you had, let's say you had a Democrat political figure on for an hour interview, you would have to have a Republican for the an equal amount of time. I believe that went away around the Reagan era. I think
Jim Garrison had that too. He was able to come on and give his say on some of the stuff going against them.
Yeah, essentially, the Jim Garrison being given an opportunity to respond to the NBC hatchet job
Yes.
Walter Sheridan was involved in.
Terrible.
Reagan was governor of California. He saw that, and so when he became president in 1987, he helped repeal the Fairness Doctrine,
which is kind of what gave way to these 24-hour news channels now, where there's not only is there not equal time, I mean, there's not even an equal voice. There's no differing narrative. I mean, you're going from one extreme host to the next. There's really not even any partial news anymore. There's no unadulterated news. Everything is an opinion show. You can watch those channels from 8 in the morning until midnight, and you're not going to get any impartial news unless there's there's some sort of a tragedy or something, or, a national emergency, something of that nature. But you're pretty much just going to get the opinion of that news station. I think that's really fueling a lot of what we're seeing in the division of this country today, where we have such hatred and such violence and these things that are happening that we see all the time. And these news networks are responsible for it. I really believe they're 90% responsible for a lot of things that we're seeing today. If there wasn't so much coverage of Donald Trump, if there wasn't so much coverage of of these things that
extreme views, Billy, extreme views,
these extremists, we would not that I don't want people to know about them, but I believe that there's just so much of it that you can't escape it, and it eventually gets to the point where you get it. I think it affects people mentally, and it's very difficult for people to deal with a lot of these things if they don't, if they're not able to handle it. I don't know, Rick, what your thinking is there, but for me,
I think you guys are right. I mean, essentially, you have radio stations that have Rush Limbaugh, and then they'll go to somebody else, and and they're all the same views. And so, if people are listening to that, they get bombarded with this information over and over and over again, and they begin to believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with if you go on the left, MSNBC did the same thing. They were screaming Russiagate to the top of their lungs over and over and over and over again. And it's like what Joseph Goebbels said: if you tell a lie once, it remains a lie. If you tell it 1,000 times, it becomes the truth.
Well, and I believe there's also saying that the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it. Right?
I think Hitler said that.
Yeah. And, and that's, unless something is done about that, I really believe we're headed, to that something.
Well, we've already got we have a merger between corporate power and government, which is it's what the fascists do and what the Nazis did. That's scary because corporations have very narrow interests, and believe me, they don't care about clean air and water. They just want to make money, and then if you have government people that they want to maintain their power and their control, and you have a lot of motivations that are not in the interests of the governed going on, and it's we need to break these things and reinvigorate our revolutionary roots. We were never a perfect country. We always had problems. Even the Constitution, as wonderful a document as it is, accepted slavery. So, and we need to be able to see our dark side and understand it and appreciate it, but we need to vigorously fight for those things that made us proud to be Americans. And one of those things that most countries don't have, we're one of a very few countries, if we may be the only one, that actually has freedom of speech as a fundamental constitutional right. But you see it because we were talking about, Operation Mockingbird is not where the CIA, when the Church Committee discovered that, and they tried to reform those things, but it didn't end. It's going full tilt now. Like I said, they're allowed to directly propagandize the American people. And that's why the Twitter files, you've got all these NGOs and the National Endowment of Democracy, the USAID, which actually President Kennedy created to help countries that were developing. The CIA has taken that over. And you've got Samantha Powers leading that. She's a neocon, and these organizations, they're just promoting an agenda that is hurting the country. Because the more we interfere with the rights of other nations, the more we spend money on national security, we're creating austerity at home, and we're creating more enemies than we can kill, and we're providing an environment where our security is constantly in jeopardy, and that's not in the interests of humanity, and it's certainly not in the interests of you and me in the United States.
Well, one thing, this was really a great discussion, and there is a lot of things that we didn't get into tonight, Rick, that hopefully you could come back and, I did want to get into more Julian Assange. I did want to get into NSA, CIA, massive surveillance programs. And I wanted to get into drone assassination programs. Maybe we could get into that next time. But the one thing I want to just mention, because we were talking about Jim Garrison, what the media did to Jim Garrison, to me, is an absolute disgrace. And I don't know if you ever seen the interview where, John Barber talked about this, where they interviewed Garrison. They asked him how many shooters he thought there was in Dealey Plaza, and he said probably 2 or 3. And then when they asked him another question, they asked him, how many people do you think were involved at planning it? And he went through, and he said, I think he said between 25 or 30 or something like that. And then when they spliced the tape together, they changed the answers. And when they asked him, how many shooters do you think there were in Dealey Plaza, they put in 25 to 30 as the answer, just to make him look like a whack job. And it's that kind of stuff that really is just a disgrace.
Well, he ended up being a prophet. I don't know if you've read his 1967 Playboy interview. Nobody else would interview him, but Hugh Hefner in Playboy.
Yes, I did.
He basically indicated that based on his experience investigating the Kennedy matter, he said our government is relegated to the Pentagon and the CIA, and basically the Congress is just a debating society. And he concluded by saying that Huey Long said that fascism will come to America in the name of anti-fascism. And he said, based on my experience, I'm afraid that fascism will come to America in the name of national security. And if you look at what's happened since the Kennedy assassination and since 9/11, they've basically sacrificed liberty for security, which is something Benjamin Franklin said you should never do.
Yes.
And they're putting tighter and tighter controls on us. They're surveilling us. The Fourth Amendment, 5th, 14, 7, 6, they're all destroying all these amendments, and people don't even know it. And that's the scary thing. And, when Roosevelt died, and we talked briefly, and I'll just do this quickly because I have a quote here that I think is very powerful, and it's in my books. Essentially, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which basically undid most of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 that recognized unions. It basically created right-to-work statutes and stuff. I don't know if you know what those are all about, but those are Orwellian phrases because they're all anti-labor. Then they passed the Internal Security Act of 1950 because they were scared to death that there could be a Bolshevik revolution here. And 2, they realized that the socialists and the communists were big players in the labor movement. Okay. And then it was the beginning of the McCarthy era to boot. So communism was like a terrorist today. People were scared to death that they were going to overrun Europe and all these things. And President Harry Truman, the Internal Security Act basically said that all communists had to register with the federal government. They could never hold a federal job, and they couldn't benefit from any federal contracts, and that they were going to be surveilled by the FBI. And President Truman vetoed that, and the Congress overrode his veto. But in his veto, he said, once a government is committed to the principle of silencing the voice of opposition, it has only one way to go, and that is down the path of increasing repressive measures until it becomes a source of terror to all its citizens and creates a country where everyone lives in fear. And that's why we need to protect freedom of the speech.
That's powerful. Very powerful, Rick.
And then something that we should all be cognizant of, because like in the COVID narrative, if you said that COVID came from the Wuhan lab, you'd be immediately dismissed as a conspiracy theorist in the same way you would be 20 years ago if you said John F. Kennedy was killed by the CIA. And George Bernard Shaw said, new opinions often appear first as jokes and fancies, then as blasphemies and treason, then as questions open to discussion, and finally as established truth. And so these things always start out as blasphemies and you're a lunatic and a kook, but overall, most of these things, the truth will come to the surface. It's like, can you guys ever imagine a presidential candidate saying that the CIA killed his uncle? I could never imagine that.
No.
2 years ago, never mind 10, 20 years ago.
Right.
Yet Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said that. And then a major host, Tucker Carlson. I'm not a big fan of Tucker Carlson, but I have to say, in the last couple of years, he took on some tough issues. I give him credit for it. He said the CIA killed John Kennedy.
Yep.
I think he's the only mainstream media person that I know of that said that.
Yeah, I agree. And that's what we do in this show, Rick. You know, we gave him credit. I mean, at least I did. I brought that up. And we always, whether you're on the left or the right, you know, if you do something that we approve of and you're out there trying to tell the truth, you know, we give you credit.
That's right, because it does. I'm for anyone that tells the truth, and I'm for justice no matter who it's for or against. As Malcolm X said, you know, I don't want an innocent person to be found guilty of anything, even if I don't like that person. I don't want them to be found guilty and go to prison for something they didn't do. And that's the way we should look at everything. You
know, it's interesting, Rick, because we do a lot of mafia organized crime episodes on the show. And, you know, I consistently get called by some listeners that are really negative on us. They'll call me a mafia lover. And it's like, I'm not a mafia lover. I know these guys are criminals. But the thing is, when I know they're accusing them of a crime I know they did not commit, like rigging the election for John Kennedy when they supported Richard Nixon, not John Kennedy.
Exactly.
I know, so I'm gonna defend them on that. When I know that the whole Carlos Marcello threat against John Kennedy was a hoax and it was a complete lie, I'm gonna defend them against that. You know, so stuff like that, I'm gonna, you know, you can't just accuse them because they're a bunch of criminals. You can't just accuse them of every crime that's ever been committed.
This may be like touting my own self-interest, but in the Hidden War, Sean and Bill, I have a chapter called The Bitter Harvest, and it talks about, it debunks the fact that Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was involved in bootlegging during Prohibition, and it debunks the 1960 election and the alleged alliance with the mob. I have all kinds of evidence. Some of it's from a great article written by Arthur Schlesinger, who was the resident historian during the JFK period.
Right.
And he wrote for Cigar Aficionado, of all places. I found it. He called The Truth as I See It. It was an awesome article, and I took from that, as well as a couple of major books, plus RFK Jr.'s book, American Values, which is a great book. I'd highly recommend that. But I wrote Bitter Harvest, and it debunks a lot of the myths about John Kennedy. I think you both would find that interesting.
Yeah, well, no, Rick, that's great work that you did there, and you know, it's just you know, that lie that's been told about old man Kennedy, and a lot of it does trace back to hatchetmen connected to Richard Nixon. It was interesting that I think a lot of it was not just to ruin the Kennedy name, but to deflect attention away from Richard Nixon, who had a long connection to organized crime, going back to Mickey Cohen, to Bill Bonanno, to Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello. I mean, they were all supporting Richard Nixon, and that's a fact. And the people that
Jimmy Hoffa,
Jimmy Hoffa. Yes.
Jimmy Hoffa gave him $500,000 to the Creep organization.
Yes. And that's in an FBI
and
file.
the only promise, which he didn't live up to, was that amount he couldn't. He wasn't allowed to try to become the leader of the Teamsters. And of course, once he got out of prison, that's the first thing he wanted to do.
Yes,
absolutely. That's what got him killed. And in fact, the Teamster leader at the time was good friends with
Fitzsimmons.
Yes, Fitzsimmons. And then Nixon had an aide or a close friend.
Ed Parton.
Who was it? He's like a Johnny Roselli. He was like a liaison to.
Oh, he was the guy that was right.
Was that Bibi Rebozo?
Yes, no. Rebozo. Yes.
It was. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. He was friends with. He was very close with like Frank Costello and Bill Bonanno.
Yeah, and then
he had a lot of connections.
And then the people that were involved in Watergate, most of them were involved in the Bay of Pigs, but also E. Howard Hunt and Frank
Sturgis.
Sturgis, I think, was they were loosely connected with organized crime as well.
Well, Sturgis had some connections. Sturgis had because that wasn't his real name. He was Italian. His real name was Ferroni. He had connections to some organized crime figures.
Yeah, I think he would. Didn't they say he was involved in Johnny Roselli's murder?
Yeah, but I don't know. The more that's something we can really. I'm not sure on the Roselli. I think the Roselli, they found paralyzing drugs in Roselli's system that that's something that the mob never uses. Paralyzing drugs. When they kill you, they shoot you in the back of the head. I mean, I think that was a CIA assassination. I think somebody wanted to see what Roselli was saying to the church committee. And
yeah,
they cut his legs off while he was still alive, while he's paralyzed. So that was a vicious interrogation, really, before they murdered him.
He did the same thing to Sam Giancana. Correct me if I'm not mistaken, because you've researched a lot of the organized crime. Is that apparently Sam Giancana let somebody in that he trusted, and they ended up killing him, and then they shot him around his mouth. Yes. And according to one of the mob, that means he had a big mouth.
Yeah, but you know what? Usually the mob doesn't do stuff like that to they usually, you get the point, they shoot you in the back of the head. That's it. They don't need to do, so there was a lot of theories on was the CIA involved in Giancana's murder? Because, he was involved, of course, with the Castro plots. And there was
CIA is worse than the mob.
Well, you know what? The FBI also, Rick, had Giancana under 24-hour surveillance, and then they cut it off. And then I believe it was like within an hour, Giancana's dead. So, I mean, that tells you something right there that but I mean, we could go on and on about all this stuff.
We could do a whole show on this. Let's
we're getting off the rails, Rick. Billy's getting nervous.
I got to bring you.
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to get us off the rails.
No, this was great.
I do have a quote for you.
Okay.
From Harry Truman, and I know this from heart because it's kind of funny because Harry Truman, they used to say, "Give him hell, Harry," and he didn't have he wasn't scared about telling people what he really thought. He basically would let them have it if he thought they deserved it. And a reporter, after he left the presidency, said, "Did you really give them hell?" And he said, "I really did give them hell. I just told them the truth, and they thought it was hell."
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's the problem that you guys deal with, and why you have some people call you names and they do is because sometimes the truth is hell to some people. They don't want to hear it.
And I think, Rick, the majority of our listeners are very positive and support what we're doing. And I would encourage them to at least take a look at your books and give those a look. And we appreciate you coming on, Rick, and always love when you come on, and can't wait to have you back. There's so much more to talk about with you, and we really enjoy it. So I hope you're enjoying it as much as we are.
Oh, I love this. I told you last time that my wife would tell you that I could spend the whole afternoon talking about this stuff because it fascinates me as much as it disturbs me, because it's, I really love my country, and I want us to be an exemplary country like President Kennedy wanted. And
right.
I wish we had different leaders and we were living up to our ideals like we did for that brief 1,000 days when he was in power.
Yes.
And I think that was the pinnacle of our power. The world admired us, and they loved our leader. And I don't think if any of our leaders died, you'd get the same reaction that he got, that all these leaders that showed up to the funeral and named highways after him and buildings, schools.
Or the reaction that Bobby got on the train ride.
Yes. I mean, those were people that people down deep knew they were sincere and had an intuitive sense that there was a narrative out there that was full of lies, because they knew better. And that's why, despite all the efforts of the intelligence communities, corporate power, the deep state, however you want to phrase it, to smear them, they're still two of the most admired people in our day.
Well said, Rick.
No question about that. All right, Rick, thank you so much. We will talk to you again, and we appreciate it. And
all right. You take care, both of you.
Thank
Thank you, Rick.
You too. And that's enough out of us.